We're on Capitol Hill sitting down with one of the warriors, I would say, of faith, family, and freedom, a great friend from the great state of Oklahoma, Senator James Lankford. Senator, thanks so much for sitting down with us.
It's great to see you again.
Let me just start with this, Senator. The values voters who are participating in this virtual conference this year, and you've been there many times before, so you've seen the folks that gather from all across the country. They're joining us virtually tonight. The headlines are not quite reflective of what you and I have seen happen in this city. There's some good things happening.
There are some good things that are happening in the city, but right now it looks like everyone turns around every day and says 2020, I'm so ready for it to get over, and it's what one more thing can happen in this year. But there's still some very good things that are happening in the engagement. Even this week, the president's executive order on life and trying to be able to protect those that are newborns, that has been such a challenge to be able to go through, and that we've had a bill dealing with born alive that we actually couldn't get addressed in the Senate. But they've been able to address with executive action. So we're watching some of those things that no one's going to notice, but we're also watching what's happening internationally. I made a comment to someone before about what happened with the UAE and Bahrain and Israel and what happened with Serbia and Kosovo, and the response was, what happened? I didn't hear. And you think in all the noise of all the news, some of the most significant peace events in the powder keg of Europe between Kosovo and Serbia coming to peace and recognition, in UAE and Bahrain and coming to peace with Israel and getting that established is an enormous international event. So you've got not only events that are happening here in DC that are on life and on values, but you've got international events that are also very significant that the media just doesn't want to talk about.
Is that by design?
Oh, sure it is. Yeah, the media doesn't want to talk about something positive. That their focus during an election time period is drive everything as negative as they can. And even in our negotiations for the bills, dealing with COVID-19 with the House of Representatives right now, they don't want to negotiate anything on COVID-19 because they don't want the president to have a win right before the election. And so literally, whether you're work at an airline or whether you are a person that's in a small business or a not-for-profit or all these different industries that are still struggling, and many of them are being successful and turned around, but some are really still struggling that need some help right now. They're not getting it because the House is just going to hold them hostage because they don't want good news to come out right before the election.
Well, they have not succeeded because the events that are about to take place with the president making a nomination this weekend to the United States Supreme Court, for the first time in months, the coronavirus has been pushed out of the headlines, and the focus is going to be on the courts, which brings all of these issues that you just mentioned into focus.
Right. Every issue that we deal with as Americans, if it deals with the law in any way, the courts are the ones that are interpreting that. And the frustration that we have is trying to be able to get courts that'll just interpret the law. It frustrates me at times when I hear people talk about conservative judges and liberal judges. I'm not interested in a conservative judge. I'm interested in a conservative legislator. For a judge, I want someone who's a constitutionalist. Just read the Constitution and interpret it as it says. Read the law and interpret it as it says. Don't make it mean something it doesn't say. That's all we're looking for in that. And if people will just look at the law and be able to follow the law, that's what myself as a conservative wants in a court setting. Now, that's not what the left wants, and it certainly was the big issue with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's an icon of the liberal left because she was willing to look at the law and interpret it in new ways that would be expansive for culture. The law changes with culture when the legislature votes to change law in culture. It's not because a court does that, but every one of these issues that we deal with as values voters all are affected by the future of some judge, someplace deciding, I don't like that law, and I'm just going to adapt it from the bench. That's something that we push back against.
Well, taking that and putting that in context with where we are as a society and where the court has taken us over the last 40 years, where abortion on demand has not come to us through the legislative branch, not through the vote of the people, but through the dictates of the court, judicial fiat. All of these issues now are coming into focus, as we just mentioned, but here's something quite significant, which is reason for encouragement, is that we could very well see with this nomination to the Supreme Court for the first time since the Warren Court, in this activist court, that we will have a majority of constitutionalists on the court. Right. That is seismic.
Yeah, that's a significant shift. And again, it goes back to just the most basic question. What do you want from a court? They interpret the law. just the law, and to be able to stick with that. And if we have a court that's focused on just interpreting the law, not making law, instead interpreting law, that gives them the opportunity to be able to look at previous decisions, that gives them the opportunity to look at new questions that are coming up to them, and just have a simple evaluation. Was the previous court following the law, or were they making law from the bench? And as they're interpreting things that are coming to them, are you just following the statutes? There's a lot of conversation about Roe v. Wade and about life. Rightfully so. There are folks in 1973 and 74 that said, that's settled, leave it alone, walk away. Americans did not walk away. Americans are still split on this issue about the most basic, obvious thing in all of the world. That is, a child is a child is a child is a child. The only difference between that child in the womb and you and I is time. There's not any difference. There's no magical transition that happens when they leave the womb. That's the same DNA that you and I both had it as an infant in the womb, we still have now. All the seeds of what we were going to become and how we were going to grow physically were all there in the womb. And so this simple realization of that seems to be obvious for everyone else. What I say to a lot of people, if what was in the womb was discovered on Mars, we would say there's life on Mars, but people struggle to say that's life in the womb. That seems obvious. So then the next question with that is, how does the court handle that? Pre-1973, the court didn't get engaged in a national mandate. They said every state has to talk about what they're going to do with abortion. Every state has to decide this. So this premise of Roe v. Wade gets to determine and abortion ends, it doesn't. Abortion then moves 50 places at that point to decide what that'll be. And in my state, in the state of Oklahoma, our legislature will step up and determine, do we value the life of every single Oklahoman in our state, or are some Oklahomans discriminated against because they're smaller? I don't think we're going to discriminate against any person for any reason, including their height.
You know, our society kind of celebrates youth, kind of dismissive of as you get older, but you know, there's benefits to being older. You have a longer frame of reference, and I've been here coming up on 20 years here in Washington, D.C. Doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it has been. You're a tad bit younger. But what I've seen are men and women like you coming to Washington in the last decade and a half that are coming here not for fame, certainly not for fortune, but coming because of a sense of calling, which tells me there's reason to have hope for the future of this country.
Yeah, I believe that there is. I was 22 years in youth ministry before I came to Congress. My wife still calls this life's greatest interruption for us. We didn't see ourselves serving in Congress. I saw myself serving in ministry for the rest of my life. But God completely interrupted our life in 2009 and 10 and called us to be able to run for Congress. This is my calling. This is my task, to be able to have ways to be able to serve my fellow man and to still be able to serve God in the process on this. I've jokingly said to people, when people will catch me and say, well, you were in ministry, now you've left the ministry. And I laugh and I say, no, this is still my ministry, of the things that I've chosen to be able to follow God in this way as well. And I feel like He has led me to it. And then people will say next to me, well, Washington, D.C. is such a dirty, awful place. How could you go there? Or they would say to me, it's Sodom and Gomorrah, and how could you possibly serve there? And I'll just smile at them and say, well, as I read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, at the end, God was pulling people out of Sodom and Gomorrah. He still seems to be sending people in to Washington, D.C. That would tell me He's not ridden this place off. And if He's not ridden this place off, we shouldn't ride it off. We should be engaged in a way. And we have a privilege with our freedom of faith that we have as Americans, that I don't have to take my faith off when I cross the boundary into Washington, D.C. I can live my faith here as much as I can live it back in Oklahoma. And that is not only accepted, but it's constitutionally protected.
You see, that is one of those stories that's not talked about in the media. We don't hear the positive. We don't hear the men and women of deep conviction. But you're not alone. I've seen so many, really since 2010 was a turning point. So the last 10 years, we've seen, the President's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, who we're going to sit down with tomorrow night, is one of those men. There's a number of pastors that are now in Congress. So it is reason for optimism, and I think people need to know that faith is a key part of what motivates and drives you and many of your colleagues.
It is, and quite frankly, I'm glad, Tony, it's not in the media all the time, because they would get it miserably wrong. When the media looks at people of faith in Congress, they go, oh, they're going after a theocracy. We're not trying to create a theocracy. That's not the model. But we also believe that you can be a person of faith and still be able to serve other people around you. You don't have to have a certain faith, or in our current media culture, they would say it's okay to say you have a certain denomination or that you have a faith. Just don't live it. Just don't let me see it. And in our culture, quite frankly, that wants to silence people or cancel people that actually live their faith out, it's refreshing to be able to be here among a group of staff that are here, a group of interns that I've met multiple times, a group of other members of the House and the Senate that generally have a faith, live their faith the best way they know how, and are choosing to be able to challenge other people to consider their faith as well.
Senator Lankford, since 1976, there's been somewhat of a consensus on the issue of abortion, and one of those areas of consensus has been we're not going to force people who are morally opposed to pay for it. That's now in question, and this is one of those issues, quite frankly, that will be decided by this fall's election. And I'm speaking specifically to the Hyde Amendment, named for former Congressman, the late Henry Hyde. You serve on the Senate Appropriations Committee. How significant is that threat that would make taxpayers fund abortions?
Yeah, the Hyde Amendment has been sacrosanct. It has to be voted on every single year in the appropriations bills when they pass to say there'll be no federal funding to pay for abortion in this funding. There's been a lot of conversation to say Americans may disagree on whether that's a life, which I think it's obvious that that's a life. But there's some Americans that disagree with that. But at least we can agree that you shouldn't compel Americans with their tax dollars to be able to pay for the taking of a life in an abortion. Well, that for a long time has been, Republicans and Democrats alike have all said, we may disagree on that, but we're not going to make people pay for abortions. Now Democrats have made this a central platform for them, that they're going to get rid of the Hyde Amendment, and they're going to mandate that all Americans pay for the abortions of other Americans that want to be able to have it. So that literally through their Medicaid dollars or through other federal programs, that people could get free abortions or reduced cost abortions, which will do nothing but drive up the number of abortions in the process as well. So for those of us that believe strongly in the value of life, we, number one, don't see that as health care. It's not health care to have an abortion. Health care is protecting life. Abortion is taking of a life. I have a bill that I just recently introduced looking through the Medicaid side of it to make sure there's no entity that's receiving federal dollars that their primary purpose is also abortion, or one of their primary functions of getting revenue is abortion. It's not just Planned Parenthood. There are multiple other entities that are out there. Our federal tax dollars should not be used for the taking of innocent life.
When you look at the policies of the Trump administration, you mentioned earlier some of the executive orders as it pertained to the born alive. Are you surprised how aggressive this president has pursued a pro-life agenda?
This has by far been the most pro-life president we have ever had. And if you would have asked me 5 years ago, when candidate Trump at that time got into the race, I'd seen some of his comments about life and things before, and he seemed to be fairly undecided on it, quite frankly, early on. And then he made some really bold statements that he was going to stand for life. And as he came into the White House, I thought, I hope he lives by those statements. And boy, has he. Not only has he been the only president that's ever been at the March for Life to be able to show up and speak there, and Vice President Pence has been there multiple times, but they've put their money where their mouth is on it, not only in legislation, in regulatory work, in the Mexico City policy, taking away anything that promotes or provides abortion overseas with federal dollars. They've been aggressive in going through the federal code line by line, looking for anywhere that promotes the taking of life and flipping that and saying, we're not going to promote the taking of life as Americans. We value every single life.
A pleasant surprise.
Yeah, it's been a tremendous surprise, and has been articulate and has been active in that, and has encouraged his agencies to look for places to protect life.
Senator James Lankford, one final question for you as we close out our time with the Values Voter Summit folks tonight. When you look at this election, we've talked about the life issue, we've talked about the funding of abortion, we talked about the Supreme Court. What are the major issues as you see this nation facing that this election will literally determine which direction we go?
Wow, there's a lot. As we face it every 4 years and look at it and say this is the most important election ever, every generation looks at what's in front of them and says, okay, we're having a hard conversation about. We have quite a few of those right now. We're having a hard conversation about life, as we've talked about. We've had a hard conversation about immigration, what direction we're going to go with individuals that are here in the country, not legally present, and what that's going to look like for people crossing the border. That's an unresolved issue for us. It's unresolved what direction the courts are going to go. It's unresolved how we're going to value women's athletics, even as odd as that sounds and as simple as that sounds. Will girls be able to compete in girls' sports against only girls? Will we have this ongoing dialogue as a country about what direction we're going to go with debt and deficit? It's an unresolved issue for us as deficits continue to accelerate, that at some point we've got to sit down as a country and go, how are we going to solve this? And to be able to work together on this, because we can't just ignore it. The issue of opioids and drug abuse and how we're going to handle this. And we've made a lot of progress, but we have more work to go. And this strange issue of the role of government, as odd as that sounds, my liberal colleagues really feel like government is able to solve everything. If only they had more money and more authority, they could solve it. And I have this firm belief that actually it's churches and nonprofits and families make a greater difference in communities than government does. So how do we empower churches, nonprofits, and families to be able to have a greater effect? That philosophical difference is very, very significant. It determines whether we head towards socialism and government control and mandates on everything and economic management of every part of our economy, or whether it continues towards freedom, the direction that we have historically headed as a country. The direction of education and where we go for the future of our children will be determined by this next election. So yes, there's a lot riding on these days.
I'm going to exercise a political background choice here. I'm going to ask you one more question as we close our time. How should people be praying as we approach this election?
Well, there's not only a biblical mandate to pray for people in authority, but it's also one of those things that we find ourselves as a culture right now saying, there was a moment when we thought we could solve all of our own problems. We're not in that moment anymore. We're not in a moment that we say, there's a couple of things we need to tweak around the edges of culture. This year has driven our nation to our knees. And it's the appropriate place for us to be able to be with God, sitting with Him, and saying, God, we're trying to solve disease. We're trying to solve racial strife. We're trying to solve cultural issues and values issues. There's economic issues that are rushing at us. We don't know what direction we're going to go as a country, but we know you. And so there's a great importance to look at the God who stands outside of time and who sees the beginning and the end just the same, and to be able to say to Him, God, we need your help as a country. There is a desperate call to a God who meets desperate needs that needs to be done by people of faith, to say, God, we trust you, and we know that you are fulfilling something larger than ourselves. And as I had someone that caught me and said, what is God doing with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death? If there's anything more contentious in our culture that could have happened right now, it could have been that. And my response to them was, I really do believe in a God who has kingdom purposes and larger things that He's accomplishing. And yes, I don't know of anything more inflammatory that could have happened right now, right before the election, than the replacement of a Supreme Court justice. But I also know He has a plan and a purpose, and we need to find out what that is, and we need to ask for His help as a nation.
Amen. Senator James Lankford, thanks so much for being with us.
You bet. It's really great to visit with you again.